We are now going to resolve Zeno's paradox using the ideas that we have seen of convergence of infinite series. If you don't recall this paradox, please watch the module on Zeno's paradox way back in week 1 again. Now, depending on which philosopher you ask, they might claim that Zeno's paradox is completely resolved. 2. Zeno's paradox is nowhere close to being resolved. Such things happen in philosophy because in philosophy you want to analyze a situation completely from infinite depth as much as possible. So when you look at it as a philosophical problem, you might get debate as to whether this paradox is resolved or not. However, I am not going to go into such philosophical depth and analyze this completely. You can please check the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy for a detailed article on Zeno's paradox and its various controversies. Rather, I'm going to highlight that if you are willing to take for granted what we have done in infinite series, it is not hard to see where Zeno got it wrong. Again, I apologize if you are a philosopher and you get offended by my cursory treatment, but this is nevertheless a mathematics course and not a course on philosophy. Okay, so recall that Zeno claimed that Achilles will never be able to catch the tortoise. But in reality, we all know that Zeno's paradox is certainly the situation that Achilles will not catch the tortoise is not going to happen. Now, there are two possible resolutions. First, obviously Zeno is wrong. Obviously Zeno is wrong from our experience, right? Essentially, what Zeno is saying is that it cannot happen that Achilles will ever catch the tortoise. That's certainly not true in the real world. Moreover, you can slightly modify Zeno's argument to show that motion itself is not possible. That objects can never move. You can repeat this same argument by replacing Achilles by any object. And to say that for the object to move 1 meter, it must first move half meter, then it must move 1/4 of a meter, so on and so forth. So it will never be able to move at all, right? Clearly objects do move in the real world and therefore there is no paradox at all. Whatever reasoning Zeno used is completely wrong because it is simply not applicable in the real world. Now this is a very practical resolution of the paradox. However, it still doesn't satisfy us intellectually. It is sort of appealing to, oh yeah, this is not the case, therefore we are done. So this is not very appealing. So let's try for a more mathematical resolution using infinite series. Mathematical resolution using infinite series. Now the question arises, what does it mean to resolve this paradox? Right? To resolve this paradox is to see and point out some flaw in the reasoning used by Zeno. If you think carefully about Zeno's paradox, the central assumption that Zeno is making to derive this paradox is that an infinite number of events cannot take place in a finite amount of time. This is the central assumption behind Zeno's reasoning as to why Achilles will not be able to catch the tortoise. The infinite number of events is Achilles first covering half the distance to the tortoise, then covering half the remaining distance plus whatever little the tortoise has moved, so on and so forth, right? So an infinite number of events cannot take place in a finite amount of time. The point is, it is up to Zeno to devise an argument to say why I should believe this. Why should I believe this? Why should I believe this? Since the central argument that Zeno makes relies on this assumption, the burden of proof is entirely on Zeno to convince me that this assumption in the box is actually an appealing assumption to make. Now you might counter and say, okay, suppose there is a person who is ambiguous. He's not yet made up his mind whether this assumption is true or false. Why should such a person not believe this assumption? Or rather, why should such a person reject this assumption? Well, we have the theory of infinite series. The theory of infinite series and convergence, where we do sum up infinitely many things and get a finite answer. Not only that, we can manipulate infinite series. We have seen algebraic properties of infinite series. We have proved non-trivial theorems about infinite series. We have even seen a real world scenario with the chocolate wrapper example that shows that summing up infinite series comes up all the time in the real world. So, there is evidence to say that an infinite number of events can happen in a finite amount of time. We have a mathematical model, the theory of infinite series, that allows us to sum infinitely many things and get a finite quantity. So, it is not the case that an infinite number of events cannot take place in a finite amount of time. That doesn't seem to be true. Or at any rate, there is some evidence to reject this hypothesis, and that evidence is this entire theory of infinite series. So it is up to Zeno and those philosophers who agree with Zeno to convince me or to convince anybody that this assumption is not really a bad assumption. They have to somehow justify that. Till that justification comes, we can always say this paradox is not a paradox. We have the theory of infinite series. Okay. This is a course on real analysis, and you have just watched the module on the resolution of Zeno's paradox.